Nobody warns you about the specific kind of tired that comes from doing everything alone. Not the tired from working a double shift, not the tired from a bad night's sleep, but the kind that settles deep in your bones after years of being the only one showing up, the only one making decisions, the only one left standing after everyone else walked away. That was the kind of tired Marcus Reed carried with him every single day. He was 38 years old, drove a truck with a cracked windshield he kept meaning to fix, and spent most of his waking hours underneath cars that belonged to other people diagnosing problems, making things run again, keeping everything together but his own life. He had calloused hands and a quiet manner, and the particular competence of a man who had learned early that complaining changes nothing, and that the job in front of you is always the only place to start. He wasn't the kind of person who described himself as struggling, because struggling implied he had a choice about it. He was just a man doing what the week required and trying, most days, to do it without becoming someone his daughter would be ashamed of. On a perfectly ordinary Friday evening in late October, he made a small decision that should have amounted to nothing. He pulled over for a woman with a broken-down car on the side of Route 9. Just that, a brief interruption, a moment that cost him less than 10 minutes and which he expected to forget by morning. What he didn't know yet, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that this moment, this exact stretch of cracked asphalt with the wind cutting through the dry leaves overhead, was the first sentence of an entirely different story. One he hadn't agreed to, one he didn't even see coming. Marcus had grown up in the kind of neighborhood where people fixed things themselves because calling a professional cost money they didn't have. He learned to take apart an engine before he could legally drive one. By the time he was 19, he was working at a garage full-time. By 25, he was the most reliable man on the floor, the one the owner called first when something complicated came in, the one the younger mechanics watched when they didn't know what they were doing. He developed a reputation for being honest with customers, which was rarer than it should have been in that business, and which earned him the kind of loyalty that kept a client base steady, even when the economy wasn't. By 30, he was a husband, a homeowner in the modest sense, and a father to a little girl named Lily, who had her mother's eyes and his stubborn mouth. The marriage had seemed solid from the outside. It wasn't. What looked like a partnership from a distance was. Up close, two people growing in opposite directions at a pace, neither of them acknowledged until it was too late. The divorce was finalized when Lily was 4. Marcus got the truck, the tools, and the kind of silence that fills a house when a family leaves it. He kept the house for 2 more years, then lost it when the rent went up and the garage's hours got cut. He moved into a smaller apartment on Birchwood Avenue 2nd floor. 1 bedroom, a kitchen that faced a brick wall, and arranged his life around being wherever Lily needed him to be. He had her every other weekend and alternating Wednesdays. And he built his entire schedule around those days like a man building a shelter in a storm. Those were the only hours that felt fully real. The rest of his life was logistics, paying bills slightly late, eating lunch at his workbench, never quite getting ahead. He was not unhappy exactly, but he had developed the habit of living inside a very small perimeter, the garage, the apartment, the drive to his daughter's school and back, because the small perimeter was manageable, and manageable had quietly become his highest aspiration without him ever consciously deciding that it should be. His buddy Terrence, who had been his best friend since middle school, had been nagging him for the better part of a year about getting back out there. Terrence was married, deeply happy in the obnoxious way only truly happy people can be, and convinced that Marcus's real problem was loneliness. Marcus's real problem, in his own estimation, was a transmission he needed to replace on a '99 Silverado and a back that hurt every time the weather changed. But Terrence was persistent. So was their other friend, Dana, who worked at the elementary school and believed in things like fate and second chances with a conviction that Marcus found both endearing and exhausting. They staged what Marcus could only describe as an emotional ambush one Sunday over bad coffee and leftover pizza, presenting him with the news that they had, without his knowledge or consent, signed him up for a local matchmaking service. Not an app, an actual human-curated service run by a woman named Margaret, who took these things seriously. There had been paperwork. There had been a profile written on his behalf. Marcus had stared at them both for a long moment and said he wanted nothing to do with it. Then Terrence showed him the profile they'd written, and it was so accurate and quietly heartbreaking, 3 paragraphs, that managed to describe a man who was fundamentally decent and fundamentally lonely, without ever making it sound pitiful, that Marcus didn't have the energy to fight it. He agreed to one meeting. 1. A Friday evening dinner at a restaurant called The Birch Table, which was the kind of place that had cloth napkins and candles and made him feel immediately like he was wearing the wrong shoes. He agreed, and then spent the next 5 days hoping something would come up that would give him a reasonable excuse to cancel. Nothing came up. The week passed, the way weeks do when you're dreading something too quickly. With too little mercy. By Friday afternoon, Marcus had finished his last job, wiped down his tools, and was heading for the exit when his coworker Pete called after him that he looked like a man walking to his own execution. Marcus told him that was about right. He climbed into the truck, pulled out onto Route 9, and started the 20-minute drive home. The sun was low and orange, the kind of late afternoon light that makes everything look briefly beautiful even when it isn't. He had the radio on. Country station. Not really listening. He was running through what he planned to say tonight. Polite. Brief. Apologetic. Hello. It's nice to meet you. I'm afraid I'm not really in a place for this. I hope you find what you're looking for. Thank you for your time. Clean. Painless. He had it mapped out like a job estimate. He was 3 miles from home when he saw the car. It was a charcoal gray Mercedes-Benz sedan, pulled halfway onto the shoulder, with the hazard lights blinking in the dimming afternoon. A woman stood beside it in a wool coat and heels, arms crossed, looking at the car the way people look at things they don't understand, and deeply resent not understanding. Marcus slowed without thinking about it. It was automatic, the way a doctor notices when someone is limping, the way a the way a carpenter sees a door that doesn't hang right. He pulled in behind her, left his hazards on, and stepped out. She turned at the sound of his truck door. Her expression was not warm. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, with the kind of posture that suggested she was accustomed to being the most composed person in any given room, and the look of someone currently reassessing whether stopping here had been a mistake. Her hair was dark and pulled back at the neck. She had a phone in one hand, and appeared to have been in the middle of a call. "I've already contacted roadside assistance," she said. It was not a thank you. It wasn't quite a dismissal either. It was a statement of fact, delivered as a barrier. Marcus nodded. He said that was fine. That he was just going to take a quick look if she didn't mind. Since he was a mechanic. And he happened to be right here. She looked at him, at the faint oil still visible on his forearms, at the truck, at his general presentation, and something in her face made a calculation. She said she didn't mind, in a tone that suggested she very slightly did. He popped the hood. It took him less than 4 minutes to find the problem. A loose battery cable, the kind of thing that looks catastrophic from the outside and takes about 90 seconds to fix with the right tools. He had the tools. He tightened the connection, closed the hood, and asked her to try starting it. The engine turned over on the first try, smooth and quiet, the way a Mercedes should sound. She stepped out and looked at him across the roof of the car, with an expression that had shifted not to warmth, exactly, but to something less closed. She opened her bag and pulled out her wallet. He shook his head. She insisted. He said no, genuinely. This wasn't a professional call. It wasn't his business. It wasn't a favor he needed money for. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between suspicion and an emotion she was working hard to keep off her face. She thought he was performing. She had seen that performance before, from other men in other contexts, the deliberate gesture designed to manufacture an impression of selflessness. She filed it under reasons not to trust first appearances, said thank you in the way people say it when they mean it, but aren't entirely comfortable with the meaning, and got back in her car. He got back in his truck. He watched in the rearview mirror as her car pulled smoothly onto the road and disappeared. He sat alone in the idling quiet for a moment, not doing anything, just letting the strange coincidence of the encounter settle. Then he remembered he was already late to a dinner he didn't want to attend, and he pulled back onto Route 9 and pointed himself toward the Birch Table. He almost didn't go in. He sat in the parking lot for approximately 6 minutes. Engine off, watching people move past the lit windows of the restaurant. He thought about texting Terrence with some excuse. He thought about the profile. He thought about Lily and the way she looked at him sometimes with this expression that was half pride and half concern, the face of someone who understood more than she was supposed to at 9 years old. He got out of the truck. The hostess led him toward a corner table near the window. He sat down. He ordered water. He looked at the menu without reading it. Then the door opened, and he looked up, and every thought in his head stopped completely, because the woman who had just walked into the birch table, still in her wool coat, her dark hair catching the warm restaurant light, scanning the room with a gaze that landed on him and froze, was the woman from the side of Route 9. She stood still for one full second that lasted approximately a year. Then she walked toward him with the steady step of someone who has survived worse things than coincidences, and she sat down across from him at the table, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "You're Marcus," she said finally. "Not a question. I'm Victoria Hayes." The candles on the table between them flickered. Outside, a car passed. Marcus said yes, he was Marcus, and he tried to think of something else to say, and came up completely empty. Victoria picked up her menu and studied it with extreme concentration, as though the appetizers were a document requiring legal analysis. He studied his menu too. The waiter came, they ordered, the waiter left. Marcus said, because something had to be said, that he hadn't expected this. Victoria said that she could say the same. There was something careful in the way she was holding herself, a kind of controlled stillness, like a person who had long ago decided that the safest place to be was behind composure. He recognized it because he had his own version of the same thing. They made small talk that felt like two people separately solving puzzles in the same room. She asked what kind of work he did. He told her about the garage. She asked where he'd learned. He told her briefly about growing up in a place where you either learned to fix things or you went without. She listened in a way that was attentive, but not soft. Then, after a pause in the conversation that lasted just a beat longer than comfortable, she looked at him directly and said with a precision that suggested the question had been sitting just below the surface since he sat down. "Do you always pretend to be kind to women you don't know? Or was that specifically for my benefit?" He looked at her. She looked at him. He said slowly that he didn't pretend to be kind. He said he was just a man who stopped to help someone with a broken car on his way to a dinner he wasn't sure he wanted to attend. There was a silence. Then, unexpectedly, something passed across her face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. And somewhere in the awkward machinery of that first exchange, something shifted by a degree so small, neither of them could have named it. The dinner did not go smoothly. It would be generous to call it tense, and accurate to call it a battle conducted entirely in complete sentences and polite tones. Marcus had arrived with a private theory about who Victoria Hayes was: wealthy, accustomed to deference, the kind of woman who viewed working-class men as either useful or invisible. She had arrived with her own theory about Marcus, a man playing the charming everyman routine, using small gestures to manufacture an impression. They were both wrong. They were both too wounded to know they were wrong yet. He said something about how he had never really been cut out for arranged setups. She said she found the premise of someone else deciding who was right for you both insulting and naive. He said sometimes people who love you know things about you that you can't see yourself. The words surprised him slightly. He hadn't meant to say something true. She looked at him. She said, quietly, that the last person who claimed to know what was best for her had cost her 3 years, 2 business partnerships, and a significant amount of money she'd spent years rebuilding. The table went quiet. Marcus set down his fork. He said he was sorry, and he meant it without embellishment. She said she didn't need sympathy. He said he wasn't offering it, he was just stating a fact. That what she described sounded like a long time to spend being seen wrong by someone who should have known better. Something moved in her expression. She covered it quickly. He looked down at his plate and thought about his own marriage, about the particular loneliness of a partnership that has stopped working but hasn't quite ended, about the way betrayal doesn't always arrive as a single dramatic event, about how sometimes it's just years of small inaccuracies that accumulate until the whole structure gives way. He didn't say any of that. But somewhere in the space between what he said and what he didn't, they had each caught a glimpse of the other's actual shape. Not the armor, not the performance, but the person underneath, still a little raw in the places that mattered most. The evening ended early. He walked her to her car out of habit, not design. They said goodnight, with the careful formality of people who are not entirely sure what they just survived. He drove home and sat in the dark parking lot of his apartment building for a few minutes, not doing anything in particular, just existing in the quiet. He had not liked her. He had not disliked her. He had, somehow, found her interesting in a way he hadn't found anything interesting in a long time, and he had no idea what to do with that information. Marcus did not intend to see her again. He had made it through the dinner, which was the only promise he had made to Terence and to himself, and he considered the matter closed. He spent the weekend with Lily. They made pancakes on Saturday morning and watched a movie she'd seen 4 times already, and when he dropped her back at her mother's on Sunday evening, he sat in the truck outside and felt the familiar Sunday night weight settle back onto his chest. Monday came, then Tuesday. He worked. He ate lunch at his bench. He did not think about Victoria Hayes more than a moderate number of times. It was on Wednesday afternoon that the coincidence happened, though later, when he understood things better, he would wonder how much of it was really coincidence at all. He was driving through the Eastfield neighborhood on a garage errand, and he turned onto Clement Street, and he saw the gray Mercedes parked in front of a low brick building. He might have kept driving if he hadn't also seen Victoria herself, coming out of the building's front door with a cardboard box of children's art supplies and struggling with it in a way that suggested the box was both heavier and more awkward than anticipated. He stopped the truck. He got out. She looked up, and for a moment her expression was purely startled, the unguarded kind, before the composure reinstalled. He took the box without asking. It was heavier than it looked. She told him he didn't have to do that. He said he knew. He carried it to her car and set it in the trunk. He looked at the building, a converted warehouse, clean and modestly maintained, with a hand-painted sign above the door that read Cornerstone Women's Resource Center. He asked what the place was. She paused. Then she told him Cornerstone was a non-profit organization she had founded 6 years earlier, with a focus on providing practical support to women navigating financial instability, domestic difficulty, or sudden crisis. Job placement assistance, emergency housing referrals, financial literacy workshops, legal aid coordination. They served roughly 230 women per year on a skeleton budget, with a staff of 4 and a rotation of volunteers. She had funded the first 2 years largely out of her own savings. The Mercedes, she added almost as an aside, was the organization's vehicle used for pickups, deliveries, donor meetings across the city. She did not have a personal car. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment 12 minutes away and took the bus most mornings. Marcus stood on the sidewalk in the thin autumn air and felt something he recognized as shame. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind that comes when you realize you have badly misread a person and the error was entirely your own. He had seen the coat. He had seen the car. He had assembled a story that fit the outline and ignored everything that didn't support it. The same mistake, he understood now with uncomfortable clarity, that she had made about him. They were standing on the sidewalk looking at each other. And for the first time since the night they met, neither of them had their hands up. She asked, carefully, if he wanted to come inside for a moment. He said yes. The interior of Cornerstone was functional and warm in the way that places are warm when the people in them genuinely care about what they're doing. Mismatched chairs in the reception area, a bulletin board covered in handwritten notes and event flyers, a stack of donated winter coats folded neatly near the entrance for whoever needed them, an atmosphere of organized forward motion and unhurried purpose. Victoria walked him through the space with the ease of someone fully at home, greeting staff by name, checking a scheduling board, pausing to help a young woman at one of the tables work through a folder of documents. She didn't rush him along or perform the tour for his benefit. She just let him see it. He watched her in this environment and understood, completely and without ambiguity, that he had been wrong about everything. Not partially wrong, Entirely wrong. This woman had spent 6 years building something that helped people in the plainest, most direct way possible, and she had done it without the kind of public acknowledgement that makes such things easier. She didn't mention it on a first date. She hadn't used it as a credential or a shield. She had just built it and run it and kept it running on a budget that most people would find insufficient for a long weekend. One of the staff members, a young woman named Cora, who was sorting mail at the front desk, looked up and nodded at Victoria with an expression that was both casual and quietly devoted, the expression of someone who has seen the person they work for show up for years without ever making it about themselves. Marcus noticed it. He filed it under things that are hard to fake. On a shelf in Victoria's small back office, a room containing a desk, a filing cabinet, and very little else. No trophies or framed press coverage or wall of donor photos. Just work. He noticed a framed quote in plain typeface. "The most radical thing you can do is take someone seriously." He stood in front of it for a moment longer than he meant to. She appeared in the doorway and said, a little dryly, that she'd found it on a scrap of paper in the parking lot when they first moved in, and it had seemed like a reasonable thing to frame. He laughed. It surprised both of them. She invited him to a fundraising event the following Saturday, not as a date, she clarified, but because the organization's handyman had recently moved to another city, and there were approximately 12 things in the facility that needed attention, and she had noticed, in their brief acquaintance, that he was good with his hands. It was the most practical invitation he had ever received. He said he would come. He came. The event was a combined donor reception and community afternoon, folding tables with food, children's activities in one corner, a small silent auction with items donated by local businesses, the particular energy of a room full of people who believe in what they're doing and show up anyway even when it's hard, and the coffee is only decent. Marcus spent most of the afternoon not at the reception but in the back, working through the list Victoria had left on the clipboard. A leaking pipe under the break room sink that turned out to be a loose joint, nothing more. A door on the second floor that had been sticking since September, which he planed down in about 20 minutes. 2 faulty electrical outlets that needed nothing more than replaced covers. A section of shelving in the main resource room that had been pulling slowly from the wall for long enough that someone had wedged a folded piece of cardboard under it as a temporary fix. He replaced the anchors, secured the brackets properly, and stood back and looked at it the way mechanics look at things they've set right, with the quiet satisfaction of a job that will hold. He worked steadily, and without needing to be checked on, which was his natural mode, and somewhere around 3 in the afternoon, Victoria appeared in the doorway of the supply room, where he was reorganizing the bracket hardware, and said she wanted to pay him for his time. He told her no. She told him that taking labor seriously meant paying for it, and that refusing payment was a form of condescension dressed up as generosity. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said after a moment that he would accept a cup of coffee and an honest conversation. She considered this with the expression of someone weighing the terms of a contract. Then, she went and got the coffee. They sat at one of the folding tables near the window while the event wound down around them, chairs being stacked, and children being gathered by their mothers, the late afternoon light going gold and long through the glass. The conversation that followed was the first one they'd had without armor on. He talked about Lily, really talked about her, about what it felt like to be a father who lived only part-time in his daughter's daily life, about the grief that lived permanently inside even the best version of that arrangement, about the Sunday evenings parked outside her mother's house, when the week ahead seemed particularly long and particularly quiet. Victoria listened without offering solutions or pivoting to her own experience. She just listened, with her full attention and without any performance of listening. He told her she was good at that. She said it was the nicest thing anyone had said to her in several months, which she acknowledged was a somewhat embarrassing data point about her recent social life. He smiled. She smiled. Not quite at each other, but in the same direction, which felt like something worth noting. The weeks that followed had a quality he hadn't experienced in years, something like forward motion, something like being seen clearly by another person and finding that the experience was, against all expectation, not frightening. They fell into a rhythm neither of them had designed or named. He came by Cornerstone on Thursday evenings, which was when the facility needed the most attention, and which happened to coincide with when Victoria stayed late, working on grant applications. They didn't plan to spend time together. They just kept ending up in the same building at the same time, and finding, consistently, that the hours passed more easily that way than they did anywhere else. There were evenings when he would finish a repair and wander toward the light under her office door, and they would end up talking for 45 minutes about nothing in particular and everything that mattered, and he would drive home feeling lighter than he had any rational explanation for. They talked while he fixed things, and she reviewed documents about their childhoods, their bad decisions, their best mistakes. She had grown up in Portland, the daughter of a civil engineer and a French teacher, raised in comfortable circumstances that she had complicated considerably. By the time she was 24, she had spent 3 years in a relationship with a man who had been charming and charismatic, and ultimately more interested in her financial stability than in her, a fact she had understood intellectually long before she allowed herself to accept it emotionally. The experience had left her with a very accurate read on people's motives and a very slow trigger on trust, and a hard-won understanding that the most dangerous thing about some people was not their cruelty, but their ability to make you doubt your own judgment until you couldn't distinguish between real affection and a well-rehearsed performance of it. Marcus told her about his marriage not bitterly, but honestly. About how he and Donna had been good together in the early years, and then gradually, imperceptibly, become strangers who shared a utility bill. About how the end of it had felt less like a catastrophe and more like an admission of a truth they'd both been avoiding for longer than either of them wanted to acknowledge. He said that the worst part of it wasn't the divorce itself. The worst part was realizing that he had stopped trying to be known by her years before it ended, and that she had stopped trying to know him, and neither of them had said anything about it. Not once. They had both chosen the comfort of silence over the discomfort of honesty, and the silence had eventually become the relationship. Victoria was quiet for a moment after that. Then she said, carefully, that she thought the things which actually ended relationships were rarely the things people pointed to afterward. They were the small silences, the things left unsaid so many times they hardened into walls. Marcus said that was exactly right. They sat with that for a moment. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. The fluorescent light in the hallway flickered once and held. Outside, a city bus passed with its headlights cutting through the dark. Marcus noticed, not for the first time, that being around Victoria made him feel like the truest version of himself, not the best version, not a cleaned-up presentation, but the actual one, with all the missing pieces visible, and nothing pretending they weren't there. It was a quality he had not associated with being around another person in a long time. And he was careful with it, the way you're careful with something you suspect might not last. Terence noticed the change before Marcus consciously acknowledged it. He texted one Tuesday evening, asking how things were going with the woman from the dinner. And Marcus, who had been planning to say fine, ended up typing a response that ran to 3 paragraphs and covered subjects he hadn't discussed out loud since Lily was small. Terence replied with a single line, "You've got it bad, man." Marcus stared at his phone for a while. He didn't argue. He was thinking about telling her how he felt. He hadn't worked out exactly what he would say. He was considerably better with engines than with declarations of any kind, but he knew the shape of it, the general direction it needed to take. Something true and uncomplicated. Something that didn't try too hard or ask for too much at once. He was aware of what both of them carried. Of the delicacy the situation required. Of the fact that moving too quickly could shatter something that still felt, right now, like it was in the process of being carefully built. He wanted to get it right. He thought he had time to figure it out properly. He was wrong about the timing, though not in the direction he expected. It wasn't his move that changed things. It was a Thursday evening in late November, and he was in the back storage room, replacing a section of baseboard that had taken water damage over the summer. A quiet, methodical job, the kind that leaves your hands busy and your mind free, and Victoria was in her office 20 feet away, and he heard voices. Her voice and another woman's voice, her development director, A practical woman named Simone he'd met briefly twice and thought of as competent and no-nonsense. He wasn't listening deliberately, but the building was quiet and the walls were thin and the words carried. He heard his name. He stopped moving. He heard mention of the garage, his garage, specifically some arrangement, some funding that had been handled quietly, some decision made without him. He heard Victoria say, "Keep it quiet and not yet, and he doesn't need to know." He heard Simone say she thought it was an unnecessary amount of complexity for what it was. He heard Victoria say it was her call to make, in the tone of someone closing a subject. He stood very still with a piece of baseboard in his hands and felt the old machinery start up in his chest, the mechanism installed by years of being surprised by people he had trusted, the one that processes new information through the filter of everything that has gone wrong before, the one that looks for the shape it fears most and finds it, reliably, whether it's really there or not. He heard what the words could mean. He assembled them into the most damaging possible interpretation, and he took that shape as the truth, because it fit what he already knew about the world, and because fitting what you already know about the world is always easier than being surprised by it. He left without saying anything. He drove home on autopilot, parked, sat in the dark of the truck cab and turned it over. He thought about the fact that he had opened up to her more than he had opened up to anyone in years, that he had told her things about Lily and about his marriage and about the Sunday evenings outside Donna's house that he had not told another person. He thought about what it meant to be helped by someone without your knowledge or your permission, about the particular sting of that, about how it felt less like generosity and more like management. He called Terrence that night. Terrence told him to slow down, to talk to her before deciding anything, not to do what he was clearly in the process of doing. Marcus thanked him, and then did exactly what Terrence told him not to. He pulled back. He canceled Thursday. He replied to her messages briefly and without warmth. When she called, he answered with the specific kind of polite distance that is worse than silence because it pretends to be fine while being definitively not. She knew immediately that something had changed. She was too observant not to. She sent a text saying she thought they should talk. He sent back that there was nothing to talk about, which was the least accurate sentence he had produced in years. She called again. He let it go to voicemail. Her message was short. She said she understood if he needed space, and that she hoped, when he was ready, he would come back and let her explain what she had actually done, because what he heard was not what he thought it was. He listened to the voicemail twice. Then he told himself he had done the right thing and went to bed and stared at the ceiling for 3 hours without sleeping. The following week moved slowly and badly. He was short-tempered at work, in the specific way of someone carrying something heavy and pretending they aren't. Lily called on Wednesday and asked if he was okay, and the fact that his 9-year-old daughter could hear it in his voice over the phone was not a proud moment. He said he was fine, and she said Dad in a tone that was entirely too perceptive for a child her age. He did not go to Cornerstone on Thursday. He felt correct and miserable, and increasingly uncertain that correct and miserable were as compatible as he'd been assuming. It was Terrence who broke it open, as Terrence tended to break things directly and without particular ceremony. He called Marcus the following Saturday morning and said he'd been talking to Dana, and Dana had been talking to Simone, and Marcus needed to come over right now because this was a situation that required actual information rather than the story Marcus had constructed inside his own head. Marcus drove to Terrence's house. He almost didn't. He sat in his apartment for 20 minutes, telling himself he had processed it correctly, and there was nothing to reconsider but the voice in the back of his head that sounded like his daughter's "Dad" in a particular tone was louder than his stubbornness, and he got in the truck. Terrence sat him down in the kitchen and poured coffee and laid out what Simone had told Dana, which was the actual account of what Marcus had overheard but not understood. 3 months earlier, before the Cornerstone Thursdays, before the long conversations, before any of it, before Marcus and Victoria had developed anything resembling closeness, Victoria had been at a Chamber of Commerce networking event and had ended up speaking with Pete, Marcus's coworker from the garage. Not about Marcus initially, about the business. Pete had mentioned, in the casual way that Pete mentioned most things, that the garage was having a rough quarter, a supplier dispute that had created an inventory problem, a slow stretch through September and October that had thinned the cash buffer considerably. He hadn't been complaining. He'd just been talking, the way people talk at those events when the appetizers are mediocre and the conversation needs somewhere to go. But Victoria had listened. She had asked a few questions, the kind that sounded like polite follow-up, but were actually the questions of someone taking notes mentally, identifying a specific and solvable problem. And several weeks later, Cornerstone had contracted with the garage for a service agreement covering maintenance and repair for the organization's 3 vehicles, including the gray Mercedes on Route 9. A real contract, properly negotiated with the garage's owner at fair market rate, with no favors implied, and no names invoked. She had not mentioned it to Marcus because she had not known, when she arranged it, that the awkward, interesting man from the disaster of a first dinner would become someone she thought about. And by the time she did know, that by the time it was clear even to her that he was someone she cared about, the contract already existed, and bringing it up felt like inserting her own name into a thing she had done before his name meant anything personal to her. It felt like making a business decision into a gesture of affection after the fact, which struck her as both dishonest and unfair to him. She had told Simone not to bring it up because she was waiting for the right moment to explain it herself, clearly, without it seeming like something it wasn't. She hadn't found the moment yet. That was the conversation he'd overheard. That was the entire secret. Marcus sat in Terrence's kitchen, with his hands around a mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm, and thought about the architecture of suspicion and injury he had built in 72 hours. From those few fragments, the whole structure of it, the certainty with which he had taken it for truth, and he felt foolish and clear-eyed in exactly equal measure. He had done to her exactly what she had done to him the night they met at the birch table. He had looked at the surface, assembled a story that fit his fears, and refused to look further. And she had done the same to him first, which was why they had understood each other eventually, which was why none of this was actually surprising, which somehow made it worse and better simultaneously. He thought about all the things she had actually done, the months of quiet, unannounced work at Cornerstone. The way she had listened to him talk about Lily, the way she had given him back his own dignity, simply by taking his help seriously that night on Route 9, by accepting it as what it was, rather than making it into something else. He knew, sitting in that kitchen with Terrence watching him carefully, what he needed to do. He just needed to figure out how to do it without making it small. He drove to Route 9. Not to the restaurant. Not to Cornerstone. Not to her apartment. To the exact stretch of road where he had first pulled over, the spot with the faded white line on the shoulder and the overhanging oak tree, stripped now of its leaves in early December, the bare branches dark against the gray afternoon sky. He stood beside his truck and called her. She answered on the second ring, and he could hear in the single syllable of her hello that she had been worried, not panicking, because that wasn't how she was built, but carrying it, the way she carried most difficult things, quietly and without making it visible. He said he was on Route 9, at the spot where they first met, and that he was sorry. Not a long apology, not the performed kind where the length is meant to signal the sincerity. Just a plain one. He said he had heard something and built a story from it because that is what scared people do, and that he had been wrong, and that he had treated her badly, and that she deserved better than that from him specifically, because she was someone who had never given him a reason to treat her that way. The silence on the other end lasted long enough for his heart to do several things he wasn't particularly proud of. Then she said she would be there in 15 minutes. She was there in 12. The gray Mercedes pulled onto the shoulder behind his truck, the same car, the same road. The world colder now. The light lower and more silver than it had been in October. She got out, and he walked toward her, and he told her the rest. He told her that she was the first person he had allowed himself to actually know in years, and that it had frightened him not because she was frightening, but because caring about someone again felt like standing at the edge of something very high and not being entirely sure the ground would hold. He told her that what she had done for the garage, the contract, the quiet and uncomplicated act of making something better without turning it into a moment or a gesture was the kindest thing anyone had done for him in longer than he could accurately calculate, and that he was sorry it had taken him this long to understand it rather than misread it. Victoria stood in the cold December air and looked at him with an expression he had not seen before, not the composed exterior, not the careful distance, but something underneath all of it, something that had the quality of relief. She said, after a moment that felt considered, that she had noticed him that very first evening, when he refused the money, not because it was charming, but because it was real. She said she had spent several weeks actively trying to convince herself that she wasn't falling for him. She said that had not worked, and that she had ultimately stopped trying, because it seemed like a waste of energy she could be using for something more productive. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, meaning it as both a small joke and a thing that was simply true, "Maybe the car that night wasn't really broken. Maybe the world just needed me to stop here." She looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed a real laugh, the full one, the kind he had caught glimpses of at Cornerstone and had always found himself wanting more of. She said that was either the most romantic thing she had ever heard or the most ridiculous, and possibly both simultaneously. He said he was entirely comfortable with both. She reached out and took his hand. He held it. They stood there on the shoulder of Route 9 for considerably longer than was strictly necessary, in the good cold silence of two people who have finally arrived somewhere real, after a long and roundabout route to get there. There is a particular kind of fear that has nothing to do with darkness or danger or the absence of love. It is the fear of the person who has been hurt before, the one who looks at something genuinely worth wanting and flinches not because they don't want it, but because they know exactly what it costs to lose it, and they have paid that cost before, and they remember. Marcus had carried that fear for years, quietly, without giving it a name. The way you carry something you've decided is simply part of the weight of being who you are. They had met squarely in the middle of it and mistaken each other for the source of it, which was perhaps the most human mistake of all, seeing in another person the shape of the thing that hurt you and deciding, without investigation, that they must be that thing. What they discovered, slowly and imperfectly, and without any particular grace, was that the fear was not a warning about each other. It was simply the scar tissue from old wounds that hadn't finished healing, the kind you learn to live with when you stop expecting them to disappear entirely and start building your life around and through them instead. Lily, for her part, met Victoria 6 weeks later, at a Saturday afternoon lunch that Marcus had arranged with approximately 2 weeks of careful internal deliberation. She shook Victoria's hand with the gravity of a 9-year-old who takes things seriously, studied her for approximately 4 minutes, and then said, unprompted, that her father smiled more lately. Marcus told her that was because he was eating more vegetables. Lily looked at him with the expression that indicated she found this unconvincing. Victoria smiled into her coffee. Marcus thought about the road, the car, the loose battery cable, the 6-minute standoff in the parking lot before he went inside. He thought about the small choices that make a life, how much of it comes down to whether you stop or keep driving. Whether you ask the second question, whether you let the armor down for long enough to see what's actually in the room with you. Sometimes the people we are most afraid of are not the ones who are cruel or careless. They are the ones who look like every wound we have not yet finished surviving, and sometimes not always. But sometimes the right person arrives in exactly the wrong form, at exactly the wrong time. On a stretch of road you have driven 100 times, without ever stopping. Sometimes a second chance does not announce itself. It doesn't come wearing the right clothes or at a convenient hour. Sometimes it's a stranger standing beside a broken-down car in the late October light, cold and guarded and entirely unknown to you. And sometimes all that's required, all that the world quietly asks of you, in that small and unremarkable moment, is that you stop, that you choose, just once, to be the kind of person who doesn't keep driving. Sometimes, in a life that asks a great deal of you, that is more than enough.